Hello Earthlings, hello Wigglers. We're back in yet another episode of Little Modular. Today we are looking at this bass drum module, Mutant BD9, designed by fabulous Hexinverter. Yes, it's a bass drum module. Yes, it's inspired by the classical Roland 909 drum machine. But as with most modules designed by Hexinverter, this is just a starting point. So you get way more possibilities than just creating a bass drum with this module. It could be also a toms module. It could create even bass lines, which I will show you in a second. So it takes the original idea and expands it vastly. Let's start with the basics, shall we? This is how it sounds. The source oscillator for this module could be a sine wave, as you can hear right now, which goes from thumping 30 Hz to approximately 240 Hz. But it could also be a square wave, and you change the characteristic of this oscillator with this switch right here. Square. And a sine wave. Okay, now if this doesn't sound beefy enough to you, you also have a second oscillator, which is a sub-oscillator that could be mixed in with the original one. And this is basically a square wave. That's where you dial in the sub-oscillator. This sub-oscillator can operate in the same range as the original oscillator, but it could also operate one octave lower, and you switch it with this switch right here, or it could operate 2 octaves lower. So it gives you this seriously low end sound. Okay, you can also control the amount of the sub-oscillator with external CV source, which I'll show you in a second. But now let's go back to the original sound and take a look at some other unique features of this module. If you go to the right, you have a really unique pitch, decay and amount parameters. This is in a nutshell a pitch modulation parameter, which allows you to set the length of the pitch decay and amount. Okay, now here is a really neat trick I discovered. If you set the pitch decay to minimum and amount to maximum, you get this really nice meat, this body around 100-120 Hz maybe area. Now if I take the amount to 0, you get really nice sounding bass drum. But if I turn it up, you get this kind of chesty sound, which I really love. So this is one of my favorite settings. Now if we go to the right, we got an amp decay, which is what it says. It could make the sound short, punchy kick drum, or it could make it a long, boomy kick drum, and this could be also controlled with external CV. So you could make it alive and change the amp decay via LFO or sequencer, for example. Another feature that's really great and makes this module flexible is the click level. This circuit allows you to mix in more transients at the beginning of the sound, so it makes the kick even more punchy and clicky, so it could cut through the mix. Can you hear it? The kick gets a little bit brighter and gets more attack at the beginning. Again, minimum, and when I turn it up, it gets brighter and more clicky. Okay? Now, if you want even more beef, you could overdrive the whole signal with this drive right there. So it gets really powerful and clicky. If we engage sub-oscillator, oh, now that's what I call a really aggressive bass drum. Alright? As I mentioned before, you could use this module as a bassline module. Let's turn up the amp decay to maximum. Let's plug in a modulation, which in my case is a sequence from Metropolis sequencer. Let's stick it into the pitch input. Okay. So you can take control over the pitch. Now, if we switch it to a square wave, so now you'll know what I mean. It could just be a simple bass line instead of a bass drum. Now let's talk a little bit about the inputs and modulation. Now, besides this standard trigger in, which allows you to trigger the module with any kind of gate and trigger, you also have the accent input. If we stick another gate in here, every time the module receives a gate at this input, it emphasizes the attack, so we get sort of an accent, as you can hear right now. Okay. Pitch modulation, which I showed you previously. To the right is the amp decay modulation, as I showed you before. So you can control the amp decay and amount of it with this knob. And here you get the output of the module. Now let's get back to the accent input. You can simulate a second accent, sort of, with this sub-level input. If I modulate this with an LFO, I'm taking control over this sub-oscillator level. So you can sort of make this accent pattern with more attack and more sub-oscillator with this sub-oscillator in. So it's getting even more interesting. So as you see, it took us only a few minutes and few modulation sources to create this really organic and dynamic pattern. We're modulating the pitch, we're modulating the amp decay, we have this beefy trick with the pitch decay modulation, and we're also modulating the amp decay right here. I especially like the accent and sub-oscillator trick. It gives you this different accents, so you can feed this accent input with some different pattern and apply some different LFO to the sub-oscillator, and you get this ever-changing tribal patterns. Now, you might have noticed that I have 3 Hexinverter modules here that together form sort of a modular drum machine that consists of Mutant hot glue mixer that allows for some sound shaping with compressor and distortion circuit, and also sending individual channels to an external effect, which I will show you in a second. A Mutant bass drum and Mutant snare modules. For me, that is more than enough to construct some seriously wicked drum patterns, because these modules have so much modulation possibilities that you can really squeeze a lot of crazy sounds out of it. And let's face it, in most cases of a modern music, bass drum and snare drum is all you need and all you care about. Nobody gives a damn about hi-hats and some other wimpy percussion sounds. These are the most important building blocks of your beat. So what I have done here, I have plugged the Mutant bass drum into channel number 1 on hot glue, Mutant snare channel number 2, and to make it just a little bit more interesting, I have inserted a sample from Bastel, Grandpa and Spa combo into channel number 3. All of these channels could be routed to a herb verb by make noise. The triggers are provided by Triggerman version 2 module, which is modulated by an LFO, so we will have this ever-changing complexity and shifting of the patterns left and right. Also, the accents on both modules are provided by Triggerman, and I'm just modulating some of the parameters on the modules that I have previously mentioned. So let's hear how it sounds. That's the pattern you heard before. Now let's dial in some snare. Okay, now if you just modulate, for example, amp decay on snare, and now we do the same thing with the cut of frequency. Maybe switch some filters. Now let's dial in some of the Grandpa hi-hat. Now I fiddle with the amount of LFO, changing the pattern on Triggerman. If I switch some of the LFO speed, we get this bouncy, ever-changing pattern. Now let's play around with the bass drum. Maybe distort it a little more. Let's hear some sub-oscillator. And maybe let's switch to waveform. So, as you can hear, we get a lot of movement just out of those two modules. It's really easy to get crazy sounds in no time. So all you need is two modules, some modulation sources, trigger sources, and you can just fly away with really interesting sound design drums. So what else can I say? If you're looking for a bass drum module that could go beyond a standard vanilla bass drum sounds, and you like to experiment and to create some sound design with your drum parts, then I would say that Mutant BD9 would be one of the first choices. It's easy to operate, everything is logically laid out, you don't even need to read the manual. Just one great module. I definitely recommend to try it out. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.